If you've ever searched for the most haunting image of a fallen titan, this is the one that likely stopped your scroll. This isn't just a shipwreck. It is the definitive visual of a Navy in collapse. This is the IJN Amagi, a colossal Unryu-class aircraft carrier frozen in time at a staggering 70-degree list. It is by almost every metric the most famous carrier wreck ever captured on film. But there's a massive irony hidden beneath these rusted plates. Despite being built as a premier weapon of the Pacific, the Amagi never launched a single aircraft in combat. Instead of a glorious duel on the high seas, her story is one of a desperate camouflaged stand in the shallow waters of Kure. She was battered by thousands of pounds of American explosives until her hull literally gave up the ghost. Most history buffs recognize the silhouette, but very few understand the true anatomy of her destruction. Today we're going beyond the famous photographs. We're going inside the twisted hangars, the shattered elevators, and the failed camouflage to perform a full autopsy on the wreck of the IJN Amagi. Let's dive in. To understand the Amagi's final moments, we have to look at the bizarre, desperate state of the Kure Naval Base in early 1945. By this point in the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy wasn't a fleet anymore. It was a collection of stationary targets. The blood of the Navy fuel had completely run dry. Because of this, the Amagi was effectively shackled to the pier by February 1945, her engines silent, her massive hangars empty of the planes she was designed to carry. This is where her story takes a turn into the surreal. The Japanese command knew that American carrier groups were roaming the Pacific, looking for any surviving capital ships to finish off. Their solution wasn't to fight back, but to disappear. They moved the Amagi alongside the island of Mitsukojima and began one of the most elaborate yet ultimately futile camouflage operations in naval history. They didn't just throw some green paint on the hull. They attempted to turn a 740-foot steel fortress into a forest. Netting was draped across the expansive flight deck, woven with thousands of actual tree branches. From a distance, the goal was for the Amagi to look like nothing more than a natural extension of the island's shoreline. But they went even further. To break up the unmistakable silhouette of a carrier, they built mock houses, erected decoy buildings, and even painted fake roads across the flight deck. Imagine the sight: a weapon of mass destruction dressed up as a sleepy seaside village. Her sister ship, the Katsuragi, was moored right next to her, undergoing an even more extensive makeover. It was a desperate psychological gamble. However, this fortress of leaves had a fatal flaw. While it might have fooled a casual observer, it couldn't hide from the cold, calculated eyes of American aerial reconnaissance and the burgeoning power of radar. To the pilots of Task Force 58, these weren't islands, they were sitting ducks with trees on them. The tragic reality was that the camouflage actually hindered the ship's defense. The netting and branches made it nearly impossible to operate her anti-aircraft batteries effectively, and the highly flammable material only added fuel to the fire when the bombs finally started falling. The Amagi was a prisoner of her own disguise. She was a ghost ship. Before she ever hit the bottom, a paper tiger covered in real branches, waiting for a storm that she had no way of outrunning. The first of those storms arrived on March 19, 1945, and it would prove that no amount of leaves could protect a titan from the coming fire. The camouflage hadn't just failed. It had become a funeral shroud. In the spring and summer of 1945, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58 and Task Force 38 unleashed a series of aerial tidal waves that would systematically dismantle the pride of the Kure anchorage. For the Amagi, death didn't come as a single sudden explosion, but as a trio of escalating tragedies, the three blows that would eventually force her to her knees. The first blow landed on March 19, 1945. It wasn't a knockout punch, but it was the moment the Amagi's fate was sealed. American dive bombers pierced the morning sky, dropping 500-pounders that shredded the starboard edge of her flight deck. While the structural damage seemed manageable to the frantic crew, one hit was catastrophic in a way that wouldn't be fully realized until much later. A bomb struck the aft elevator. The explosion didn't just wreck the motors. It jammed the massive lift in the down position. In the iconic wreck photos we see today, that gaping hole in the lowered elevator remained one of her most haunting and recognizable features, a permanent scar from the very first day of her ordeal. The second blow, delivered on July 24th, was far more sadistic. This wasn't just an attack. It was an execution. Two bombs bracketed the bow, the hydraulic shock of the near misses ripping through the hull and flooding the forward bomb magazine. Then came the blockbuster, a massive 2,000-pound weapon that struck with the force of a falling skyscraper between the two elevators. The detonation occurred deep within the upper hangar deck, and the result was carnage. The explosion was so powerful, it blew the hangar walls outward, literally disemboweling the ship. A massive section of the flight deck simply ceased to exist. As fire raged and water poured into the lower decks, the commanding officer made a controversial call. He ordered the ship abandoned. The engineers protested, believing they could still save her. But the Amagi was already low in the water, her spirit broken by 2 tons of American steel. The final blow arrived on July 28th. The U.S. Navy returned to find the Amagi already listing a wounded giant, shivering in the shallows. They didn't need direct hits anymore. A series of near misses acted like underwater hammers, pulverizing the port side of the hull and opening new vents for the sea to rush in. As the pumps failed and the list grew to a terrifying 70 degrees, the laws of physics took over. By the morning of July 29, 1945, the most famous carrier wreck in history had completed its slow-motion roll. The Amagi settled onto the muddy floor of Kure, her port side buried in the silt, her starboard hull exposed to the air like the bleached ribs of a whale, a monumental ruin that would capture the world's gaze for decades to come. To look at the wreck of the Amagi is to witness a masterclass in naval destruction. Most shipwrecks are mysteries hidden under miles of dark water. But the Amagi was different. Because she sank in the shallows of Kure, she remained a public spectacle, a massive 20,000-ton visual paradox. When you study the forensic details of her anatomy in those iconic post-war photos, you aren't just looking at a sunken ship. You're looking at a titan frozen in a violent death roll. The most jarring feature is, of course, that 70-degree list to port. It is an angle that defies the mind's eye. The ship didn't just settle. She leaned into her grave so heavily that her starboard side was thrust high out of the water, exposing the red-painted belly of the hull that was never meant to see the sun. At low tide, the waterline receded to reveal a jagged black streak of oil and algae, marking exactly how deep the Pacific tried to swallow her. At the stern, the massive propellers, the screws that should have driven her at 34 knots, were suspended in midair, useless and dry, like the fins of a stranded whale. But the true inside story of the Amagi is found amidships, where the destruction becomes skeletal. This is what makes her the most famous carrier wreck, the visibility of her internal organs. Because the 2,000-pound bomb from the second blow detonated inside the upper hangar, The pressure had nowhere to go but out. It literally disemboweled the ship, blowing the hangar walls clean off their frames. In the photos, you can look straight through the ship's midsection. You can see the internal supports and the massive funnels, which usually sit hidden behind layers of steel armor, now exposed and twisted like broken ribs. It is a rare, haunting look at the guts of a carrier that you almost never see in naval photography. Then there is the island, the brain of the ship. Remarkably, despite the carnage just feet away, the bridge structure remained largely intact. It sits perched on the tilted flight deck like a lonely watchtower. Below it, the empty gun tubs tell a story of total disarmament. The 12.7-centimeter dual-purpose guns were gone, leaving behind hollow circular sockets that emphasize the ship's helplessness. Even the flight deck itself tells a tale of agony. The steel plating is buckled and caved in, particularly around the aft elevator, which remains stuck in its down position, a permanent doorway into the flooded darkness below. The Amagi's anatomy is a map of her suffering. Every twisted girder and every inch of exposed hull is a testament to the sheer volume of ordnance the U.S. Navy poured into Kure. She wasn't just a wreck. She was a giant open-air museum of the end of an era. But as we'll see in the next chapter, even this permanent-looking monument wasn't allowed to rest. The giant had one final journey to make, and it would be the most undignified of them all. For over a year after the surrender of Japan, the Amagi remained a silent, tilted ghost in the waters of Kure. She had become a part of the landscape, a massive rusted monument to a war that had moved on without her. But by late 1946, the time had come for the giant to face her final, most undignified chapter. The resurrection of the Amagi was not an act of mercy or restoration. It was a cold industrial autopsy designed to clear the harbor and harvest the thousands of tons of precious steel locked within her hull. The salvage operation, which began in November 1946, was a feat of engineering as dramatic as the sinking itself. To the engineers of the occupation era, the Amagi was a 20,000-ton problem sitting at a physics-defying 70-degree angle. You couldn't simply pull a ship like that back to the surface. First, they had to lighten the load. Workers swarmed the exposed starboard side, erecting a massive web of scaffolding that looked like an iron spider web draped over a carcass. From these precarious perches, they began the dissection. They didn't just patch the holes. They systematically sliced away the ship's upper anatomy. The remains of the flight deck and the shattered hangar walls, the very parts that made her so famous in photographs, were cut away piece by piece. As the top heavy weight was removed, the focus shifted to the guts of the ship. Divers descended into the dark, oil-slicked labyrinth of the flooded lower decks to patch the jagged wounds left by those 2,000-pound American bombs and the devastating near misses. It was a race against the tides. They had to seal the hull tight enough to hold air, turning the ship into a massive steel balloon. By July 1947, after months of grueling labor, the pumps were finally turned on. The sound of groaning metal echoed across the bay as compressed air forced the sea out of her belly. Slowly, agonizingly, the Amagi began to shift. The 70-degree list that had defined her silhouette for 2 years began to level out as she regained her buoyancy. On July 31st, 1947, the Amagi finally came off the bottom. She was no longer a proud carrier. She was a hollowed-out shell, a floating shadow of the Titan she was meant to be. On August 30th, she was lashed to tugboats and towed away from the shores of Mitsukojima for the last time. Her destination was the Hitachi Zosen shipyard, where the torches of the breakers were waiting. The most famous carrier wreck in history was being led to the slaughterhouse, leaving behind nothing but an empty space in the water and a collection of photographs that would haunt naval history forever. By the end of 1947, the IJN Amagi was gone. She didn't find her final rest in the deep crushing silence of the abyss like the Yorktown or the Akagi. Instead, she was consumed by the very industry that created her. Her steel melted down to rebuild a nation that had moved on from the dreams of empire. Today, if you visit the shores of Kure, the water is clear and the horizon is empty. There are no rusted masts breaking the surface, no oil slicks reflecting the sun, only the quiet lapping of waves where a titan once lay on her side. Yet despite being physically erased, the Amagi remains the most famous carrier wreck in history. Her legacy isn't written in battle honors or successful sorties, but in the power of a single haunting image. She stands as the definitive visual epitaph of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force that began the war with the world's most advanced carrier doctrine and ended it as a collection of paper tigers draped in dead branches hiding in the shallows. She is a reminder that in the face of total war, even the most massive achievements of engineering are fragile. The Amagi was a ship built for a world that no longer existed by the time she was launched. Her story is one of profound waste, thousands of hours of labor, tons of precious resources, and the lives of her skeleton crew all sacrificed for a carrier that never once felt the spray of the open sea or the roar of her own planes taking flight. She was a warrior who never fought, a queen who never reigned, and a wreck that refused to be forgotten. We study her today not just because of the dramatic angles or the twisted steel, but because she represents the anatomy of an ending. She is the bridge between the age of the battleship and the age of the nuclear dawn, a rusted, tilted monument to the fact that even the mightiest titans can fall if they have nowhere left to sail. If this deep dive into the shattered hangars and the tragic end of the Amagi resonated with you, there are many more stories waiting in the depths. Naval history is written in more than just textbooks. It's hidden in the rusted hulls and the forgotten blueprints of ships like these. To join us as we continue to perform these historical autopsies and uncover the secrets of the world's most iconic shipwrecks, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep these stories afloat. What ship should we investigate next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, keep exploring.